Sauna is a Finnish horror movie from 2008, and depending on which market you're in, it might go by a different name. In some markets it's known as Filth, and in some markets it's known as Evil Rising, which is very understandable because the imagery of the sauna, the word doesn't really conjure up the same sort of ideas abroad as it does here, because here in Finland there's a long history and long tradition of the sauna not just being a place where you go to wash your ass, but also where women used to give birth and where you used to wash dead bodies. And also there's a long tradition of people washing away their sins in the sauna, and that's the tradition this movie kind of zooms in on. It takes place in the 1600s, right at the end of the Russia-Swedish War that lasted like 25 years and was very brutal and bloody, and it follows a troupe of soldiers and scribes who are tasked with splitting the countryside, the marshlands of Finland between the two nations, and they're drudging through making a map and lining everything out and making everything, official. During their drudge through this marshland, they get lost in a fog-filled swamp, which seems to kind of operate under its own rules of logic and, everything else, and they pretty much get stuck in this kind of limbo in this swamp that has this village in it. And it's very much like being trapped in a kind of hell on earth or a limbo, where a lot of the characters who are veterans of that bloody war face their past sins and kind of have a lot of issues on their conscience that they need to face, that they're very much in denial of. If you're a fan of things like the Silent Hill video games, I would say this is right up that alley, and that's exactly the sort of niche this tickled when it tickled my fancy. I'm a fan of the Silent Hill games, especially the early ones, and this felt very much like that stuff. Very good horror stuff, very atmospheric, and the kind of period that it takes place in also lends it a lot of entertainment value. The characters are great, and I can't really express well to a foreign viewer how much I enjoy the dialogue, because a lot of Finnish movies use very natural dialogue, and this one uses very dramatic and kind of unnatural dialogue that is very entertaining and very lush and enjoyable to listen to. So yeah, I definitely recommend Sauna. Psycho Goreman, which is an awesome, absurd, quirky, little gory comedy movie that came out in 2021. And I love this movie to bits. It's awesome. It's a laugh fest all the way through. Its basic premise is that if you took E.T., but instead of having the sweet, innocent kids, you will replace them with asshole kids. And instead of having a sweet, innocent alien, you replace him with a bloodthirsty conqueror warlord from another universe that looks like a Power Rangers villain, and you give the assholes a control gem that lets them magically control this bloodthirsty monster. You pretty much get the picture of this tongue-on-cheek kind of gory movie where a bunch of hijinks based on that premise are going to unfold, and you're gonna just laugh your ass off. I promise you. This is a great movie. The only downside might be that some people have criticized that they find the asshole characters too much of assholes, that they're more annoying than funny, but that's up to personal taste. I really like the kids as well. And the movie it reminds me a lot of early Peter Jackson stuff, where it's very just absurd and you're just laughing what the hell am I looking at? And there's all sorts of nice little references and nods to different things, like E.T., the main character being known as PG, Psycho Goreman, and all sorts of things like that. The practical effects are very lovely and very arts and crafts looking, but still they're just so precious and sweet. I'm gonna put the link to its trailer into the description box, and I'm gonna put the trailers of every movie I talk about here in there, and you should, do yourself the favor of watching all the trailers of the movies that interest you that I'm talking about, because I can't really show actual bits of those movies in this video. So yeah, I definitely warmly recommend Psycho Goreman. Videodrome is a David Cronenberg movie from 1983, and it's a very cerebral kind of science fiction thriller and a horror movie, very much in the body horror and psychological horror category. It's very much about things like brainwashing, indoctrination, losing your sense of self and the control of your mind and body, and it being kind of controlled by other outside nefarious forces. And this movie, I first of all, it's very smart, engaging, and I really love this movie, but it's also extremely contemporary. Out of all the movies that I can think of where it's aged like fine wine and only become better due to changes in the contemporary world, this movie pretty much tops that list, because the subject matters it deals with have only been intensified and made things like this movie more and more hard-hitting and something people really should check out. The plot is basically that a man is running this kind of seedy little UHF kind of station on TV, and he is presenting material to the audience that is kind of risque and kind of like riding the fine line of not stepping into outright pornography and things like that, but riding that fine line. And he gets more and more interested in going deeper and deeper into the limits of what he can like get into and pull off on his TV station, and he winds up pirating this strange signal, this strange channel from abroad that plays this kind of simulated torture, this BDSM kind of torture scene, and he gets obsessed with it. And the more and more he watches it, the more and more intense it gets, and more he starts to hallucinate and see things that he saw in that broadcast in real life, and he starts to basically do things that he normally wouldn't. And the thing is that a lot of people back in the 80s might have been very apprehensive about like the effects of spending your whole day in front of a TV and watching like gory, violent movies, or watching news feeds that are nothing but violence, and misery all day long. But I think these days, when you have like these crazy mass shootings where you find out that the people committing these horrible acts were kind of like indoctrinated and made into extremists on these kind of perverted image boards, all these Chan boards where like psychosexually damaged people go to spend half of their time hating a group of people and the other half of their time masturbating to that group of people. You know, that sort of stuff. And then they wind up, in the evening news kind of like massacring people and like quoting stuff from those image boards. This is very much that. This is very much that, and this is a very good movie, and it's something that really I recommend warmly to anybody who's interested in that subject or who's interested in seeing a very good science fiction horror thriller movie. Check it out. Elena is a Russian drama film from 2011, and it's a very class-conscious kind of drama film. It draws inspiration from works such as Crime and Punishment, which is pretty much my favorite when it comes to literary classics. It meditates on subjects like guilt and shame and desperation motivating people into doing immoral acts and kind of trying to justify them afterwards through morals and kind of a situation traditional kind of moral relativism and all these kind of different things. The story of Elena tells about this middle-aged couple where Elena is the woman and she comes from a very meager financial background while her husband comes from a very affluent financial background. Elena has a son who is an outright loser and a very deplorable kind of a character, but he has kids. They're Elena's grandchildren and she cares very much for them. While her husband, the affluent man, has a single daughter who's a very estranged daughter, who's very cynical and who doesn't want to have any part in her father's life. Now, Elena's children get into financial strain and she tries to use her husband's kind of resources to help them out, but the husband is very reluctant to help them with his money. And when it happens that her husband suffers a heart attack, he gets really scared about his own mortality and wants to write up a will. Now, in that will, everything is gonna go to his estranged asshole daughter, and just almost nothing is gonna be going to Elena to help her grandchildren who are struggling. And that brings up the kind of crime and punishment kind of comparisons and inspirations. I'm not gonna say what happens, but it's not like it's a surprise. But this movie deals with guilt and shame and this kind of like sacrificing your own dignity and kind of conscience for the betterment of others and for a greater good. The acting performances in this movie are great. The all-around direction and cinematography and everything is great. I really love this movie, and it speaks on a subject I really care about, and I warmly recommend this one. Suspiria from 2018 is a horror movie and a remake of an Italian classic by Dario Argento that goes by the same name. The original Suspiria was a very dreamlike and stylized kind of mystery film, a horror film where in this dance academy in Berlin, strange, unnerving things were happening. People were disappearing, strange occurrences happened left and right with maggots and all sorts of macabre things, and the grand reveal at the end was that it's because this dance academy was run by witches. This movie expects you to kinda know that premise already, or if you don't, just accept that from the beginning this is a movie about witches running a dance academy. It really dives into their world and into their kind of political schemes inside their own kind of community, how they conduct spells through dance and do dark rituals in these performances that are very intricate and specific, but look to our eyes very much like interpretive kind of modern dance that doesn't seem to have all that much structure, but it sure does in the witching world, and the results of their horrible rituals and curses are just grotesque to behold, but they're also very impressive. This movie is very entertaining and impressive, though it is quite long, so if you're not into it, you might feel its length, but that's beyond the point, really. That's something that comes up with just about every movie. I really like the way its visuals through the dance are conducted, and a lot of the character work that's done, and also I really like that the kind of setting of Berlin being right next to the Berlin Wall, it really plays into certain themes with the movie. It really plays into the power struggles and the kind of lines being drawn in the sand with a lot of different characters who are vying for power within the kind of witch community. And I really like this kind of devil-worshipping evil witch kind of horror genre that's being pretty ripe right now. The Witch, and Hereditary and other works like that, and this are really really throwing gas into the fire on that front, and I really like it. I'm really into this kind of Christian horror, let's say, this kind of scary women who have power and influence and are willful and all that, and then putting on the fantasy layer on top of that. It can go into exploitation territory sometimes, but all those movies that I mentioned just now are fantastic movies. You should really check those out too. But here I'm like pointing out that Suspiria is the one I'm really recommending here. It's awesome. I really hope you check it out. The Lost Skeleton of Cadavra is a hilarious parody movie from 2001. And you know, they say about parodies that you can't really do them well unless you really love the thing that you're parodying. And it's very clear from this movie, it like flows through it how much the creators really love the kind of 1950s science fiction films, and especially the B-movie kind. The kind with bad characters, bad actors, bad dialogue, bad monster suits. All the locations take place in Vasquez Rocks, you know, and all these different things, they're all here. Of course, this takes place in Vasquez Rocks, and there's characters like a good scientist, an evil scientist, some crazy aliens, and of course there's the Lost Skeleton of Cadavra, a character that I can't stop laughing at whenever it's flailing about, because it's so clearly one of those biology class kind of dummy skeletons that the actors are just pushing and pulling around and putting its hands on their throats when it's choking them and all sorts of different things like that. It's just so hilarious. All the characters are after this very scarce, strange resource called atmospherium, and it's like hijinks ensue. There's great characters, great moments, and just fantastic hijinks and gags. This is just perfect, but I would guess that if you're not a fan of the 1950s B-movies, or at least you're not kind of like in the know when it comes to them, when you come across different kind of gags, if you don't recognize what they're basically parodying, maybe it's not gonna be your cup of tea, but I just love this movie to bits. A friend of mine on YouTube sent it to me one time, and I kind of skipped watching it, but once I finally did watch it, I immediately fell in love with it. This is awesome. Thanks, Matt, again, from the future. Turin Horse is a Hungarian film from 2011, and it's a very slow and miserable kind of drama film, very laced with the works of Friedrich Nietzsche. The basic premise of the film and the story is about this cab driver, his old horse, and his daughter, all living in the same farmhouse, kind of surrounded by this apocalyptic kind of storm that's going on and brewing and blowing everything kind of away. And they're living their daily grind one day at a time, one miserable day after the other, waking up in the morning, eating potatoes, staring out the window, taking the horse out, and just waiting for the next day to come so that you can eat potatoes again and stare out the window and just wallow in this lonely, abject misery, in this kind of haunting abyss, this kind of darkness, this kind of soulless existence. The characters are constantly offered different kinds of ways to help themselves out of their situation, kind of ways to leave the farmhouse somewhere else, else, maybe kind of a knowledge of the outside world and human contact and wisdom and all these different things. They are constantly offered basically opportunities for agency in their lives, and each time they resent it, they reject it, and they just return back to their horrible, miserable grind and their routine. And every day, if something goes wrong, they just kind of shrug and wallow in its negativity and its kind of like doom, and just, well, we'll try again tomorrow kind of thing. It's very... This movie is not for everybody, because it can easily be just miserable and boring to a lot of people, but I think the cinematography doesn't make the daily grind too repetitive in the way that it would be unsatisfying as a viewer and unentertaining, but it's very much like it really iterates to you. It really expresses to you as a viewer this kind of state, this mind state of like depression, this kind of recognizing that your life is kind of like in a limbo and a kind of a living hell, and you don't see any end to it, and you don't want to take any initiative to fix it, and you reject agency in your own life and control in your own life. It's like you have one answer to any one problem, and if it doesn't work, it's like you're lost, and you accept that you're lost, and it's very unique, because I don't know if I know another film that expresses that feeling that well. This is a very haunting film to watch. It's not like sadistic and trying to like make you cry or something, but it's something that kind of makes you feel kind of like there's a hole in your soul when you watch it. It's haunting, and it's desperate, and it's kind of like you recognize, if you've gone through any bouts with depression, any battles with this kind of just fatigue and just this kind of grind where you feel like there's no like higher calling in your life, or any kind of sense of pride or identity or like anything like that, this very much might speak to those senses in you, as they did to mine, because I've gone through something like that at one point in my life. So this is a very unique film that I really wish anyone who's interested by the stuff I said would watch. Showdown in Little Tokyo is an action buddy cop movie from 1991 starring Brandon Lee and Dolph Lundgren as a pair of LA cops taking on the Yakuza. And this is a really silly, kind of tongue-on-cheek action movie that it's very reminiscent of the 1980s kind of buddy cop movies and muscle movies like the Arnold ones, you know. And this one, it's like the tail end of that kind of timeline when it comes to those kinds of movies, to where the kind of one-liners are already like really like a bottom of the barrel, kind of scraping the bottom, and they're not very good, but they're kind of so over the top and dumb that they're very entertaining. This movie is actually a very good action movie if you think about it. There's a good villains, there's good action, good like stunts and everything, but it is silly as hell. Some of the lines, man, I think Brandon Lee compliments Dolph Lundgren on the size of his dick at least twice, but I don't know, it's awesome, it's fun, and Gary Dakawa is the main villain of this movie, and I just love his face. He has that snake-like face, and as a super serious, like super lethal kind of Yakuza leader, he pulls it off magnificently. And you know, this movie, it's best enjoyed with a belly full of beer and your mates friends around the TV with you, laughing along at it, and, watching this as opposed to watching something serious all the time. This is a great release of that kind of tension. So yeah, I definitely warmly recommend Showdown in Little Tokyo. It might be my favorite Dolph Lundgren movie. The Fountain is a Darren Aronofsky film from 2006, and it's a drama film mostly about the acceptance of death and its inevitability. Hugh Jackman plays a research scientist, a doctor, who's out looking for a cure for a deadly brain tumor that his wife has been diagnosed with. His wife, played by Rachel Weisz, has completely accepted her own mortality and come to terms with her fate, while Hugh Jackman's character is in complete and absolute denial over it and is drowning himself in work trying to find the cure instead of spending his wife's last years and moments with her. This movie tells its story in kind of three different narratives that are like interspliced on top of one another, and they all work to tell this metaphorical single story about the kind of inner workings of the characters' minds and their kind of anguish and their kind of journey through this kind of state of denial into a state of acceptance. There is a layer of the actual literal real life of the modern world, and there is a story that Hugh Jackman's wife is writing about a conquistador in search of the Tree of Life in South America. And the third story is about a kind of a monk kind of character that is also played by Hugh Jackman, who is struggling with all sorts of inner turmoil and who is traveling through space in this kind of a bubble with a kind of a dead tree inside of the bubble. He's traveling through nebulas and emptiness and all that, and he is very much lost. Now, a lot of the storylines having to do with those three narratives are all like very up to the viewer's interpretation, but this movie is very emotionally driven. It's not a puzzle to be solved, really. It's much more about just experiencing the movie, and with the visuals, the soundtrack, and everything, intersplicing together this kind of a spiritual journey of understanding kind of this cycle of life and some sort of a sense of rebirth through nature and giving back to the kind of ashes you were born out of, and all sorts of things having to do with stardust and things like that, where the kind of raw elements that make up a human body originate from, and all these different things. This is a very big roller coaster emotionally to watch, but it's so satisfying. It really resonates with me, and it really like tugs at my heartstrings and really like makes me like emotional when I watch it, but it's so satisfying. I really love this movie, and I feel like a lot of people might have slept on it, because every time people talk about great Darren Aronofsky films, people usually talk about Requiem for a Dream, The Wrestler, Black Swan, etc., but this kind of gets overlooked, and I wish people didn't overlook it. I warmly recommend this one, though get ready to be emotionally kind of charged when you watch it, and I have heard people kind of give negative reviews about it as well, but that's usually because of, in my experience, of where in their lives kind of people are. Some people might find something like this kind of pretentious, while others might think that it speaks to their kind of mind frame and how their emotions are dealing with death and the like, you know. So for me, it's an easy answer. It definitely speaks to my emotions and my kind of ways of looking at this kind of grander scheme of things, kind of mixing certain senses of like spiritual stuff, but not in a literal kind of way, and kind of emotions this and biology that and all these different things. This expresses those kinds of intuitive, kind of emotional reactions really well, and I love this movie. The Raid Redemption is an Indonesian action film from 2011, and it's an awesome balls-to-the-wall action movie with great, fantastic kung fu fights and stunts galore. It tells the story of an elite SWAT team raiding an apartment building that's being used as a base of operations by a crime lord, but it turns out to be a trap. Once the SWAT team has scaled a few floors, the bottom section gets closed off, and they're trapped inside fighting for their survival. And if it sounds familiar to the Carl Urban Judge Dredd movie that came out just at the same time, I think that's more of a case of great minds thinking alike rather than anybody stealing or plagiarizing from anybody. They're both awesome films, but they kind of focus on different things, even though the premise is very similar, whereas the Judge Dredd movie is much more about the kind of cool, badass RoboCop style, action and gore and this kind of science fiction atmosphere. This movie is much more about the kung fu and the hand-to-hand combat and the kind of desperation that the situation brings up, because they're much more human and vulnerable than Judge Dredd, where, well, then again, when you watch the movie, the characters might not feel very vulnerable, especially the main characters, but you know what I'm talking about. Come on. The action is awesome. It keeps kind of escalating from one fight to the next, as you would expect, but I would say that even though I love the kung fu stuff all throughout the film, the last fight is kinda over the top to the point where it just rides the line of being too over the top, and I think if anybody sees me promoting this and they are also a fan, they might say that you should really check out the sequel, and the sequel starts from the level of over-the-topness where this left off, and its first fight is as over-the-top as this one's climactic final battle, so you can guess how over the top that movie winds up going, and for me, it's too far. So yeah, this one, however, I would warmly recommend. It's an awesome movie. The only downside, I think, would be that it's a very dark movie, and not in terms of tone, but the actual environment. The apartment building is very dark. All the characters are wearing black. They all have black hair or black helmets, so, it kind of can be, hard sometimes to figure characters out from one to the other, and also it's just the kind of kung fu can get kind of over the top. But for those of you who enjoy like Hong Kong action movies, this is just like a Hong Kong action movie minus the comedy. This is great shit. Check it out. Hard to Be a God is a Russian science fiction fantasy film from 2013. It's based on a book by the same name, written by the same brothers who brought you Roadside Picnic, that was later turned into The Stalker, a very famous Soviet science fiction film. This movie, however, doesn't really follow its source material all that religiously. The basic premise is the same, that being that a group of astronauts discover a planet that is so similar to Earth that it's basically a parallel Earth, only it's 800 years behind. But the thing is that for the past 800 years, it has been in that same state. It has been going through its dark ages for the past 800 years. Enlightenment just can't seem to penetrate the people of this planet, and they can't seem to move forward from all the inquisitions, all the torture, the plagues, the misery and violence and ignorance and pogroms and things like that. Just horrible, horrible place to be. The plot follows one of the astronauts who has kind of flourished in this environment and is trying to effect change through political power play and things like that. Though I think the original book dives more into the kind of political power structures of this setting and also the nitty-gritty details of different locations and whatnot, whereas this movie is much more of a tour of the setting, and it's not a tour like, oh, here's the Shire, oh, here's Rivendell. No, it's basically a tour of horror. It's a tour of depravity. This setting is the most pure example of grimdark I've ever seen on the screen or in film. You will be so appreciative of having a shower and clean sheets in your bed after watching this. This is so foul. There's so many scenes of torture, of disgusting, just absolutely disgusting, gross human beings, dunking somebody headfirst into a pit of shit, rubbing the viscera of an impaled woman on your face, all these sorts of horrible things. People are drunk and swinging swords around. They're these religious leaders are like a caricature of a caricature of a caricature, to the point where they're just they're demons, basically. This is like a hell on earth, this movie setting, and it's a unique film. It's 3 hours long. That's gonna be a very big repellent to a lot of people, but I promise you, if you watch its trailer, and if you look at some of the pictures of this movie from Google Image Search, you will know if you want to watch it, because the imagery is very evocative, it's very gripping, it's very interesting, it's very unique. It's there's a lot of grimdark and horrible medieval settings that have this kind of very crude and brutal kind of atmosphere and architecture and human beings, human faces, and this goes a lot further with those things. So if that is something that rubs you the right way, check it out. I promise you, you will enjoy it in all the worst ways. Encounters at the End of the World is a Werner Herzog documentary from 2007, and it's about Antarctica. Well, not really. It's not like an educational documentary about the continent per se. It's more about what inspires Werner Herzog, the filmmaker, about the continent and the people working and living there. Whether it's natural locations that fill you with awe and wonder, like ice caves and volcanoes, or the kind of frozen ocean underneath a thick sheet of ice, where creepy crawlers are kind of crawling on the ocean floor, or majestic seals are floating through the freezing water, or whether it's the people who have their own kind of dreams and ideas and viewpoints and all sorts of perspectives that really inspire Werner Herzog. A lot of those people are very I don't want to say misanthropic, but people who really want to get away from it all, people who want to be in the middle of nowhere, literally, and people who want to really advance their field that they're studying, that they're really enthusiastic about. And that's what Werner Herzog documentaries really are usually about. I kind of reject the idea of documentaries being first and foremost adult education content. I feel like documentary films are just one type of film that uses its own tools to convey a lot of the same kind of ideas that you would want to convey with other kinds of films. And with Werner Herzog, he usually goes to whether it's people or these kind of natural things that give him a sort of either this kind of interest, this burning interest in kind of unique individuals that are kind of quirky and eccentric and kind of these mad geniuses, not perhaps in this kind of like progressing the human race kind of geniuses, but I mean just in this kind of shamanistic kind of having this mad wisdom kind of thing. And he also really loves our relationship to nature in this kind of very fearful and reverent kind of way, where he has almost like religious experiences with the awe he feels about the kind of destructive and life-giving and this kind of merciless uncaring nature and wilderness. And that's very interesting, and I feel like he might repeat those themes quite a bit in his documentaries, but of all of those documentaries, this is definitely my favorite and one I warmly recommend to anybody. I think a lot of people have seen one of the scenes from this documentary about a penguin who gets lost and is doomed because of walking to the kind of inner continent and getting lost from all the sources of food and water and not turning back even if you try and aid it. And it's a very heartbreaking scene, but there are a lot of heartbreaking and inspiring scenes in this one. I definitely recommend it very warmly. Check it out. Turbo Kid is a post-apocalyptic comedic adventure film from 2015, and this is a really fun Canadian movie. It's very sweet. It's very like it has tons of heart. It has some really pure and lovable characters, the main characters in particular, and their relationships and the story of them trying to take down the evil Michael Ironside is just tons of fun. The whole tagline of Mad Max on a BMX is very hitting. The movie is kind of presenting itself as if it was legitimately an 80s movie, and it's not like a superficial kind of 80s nostalgia exploitation movie. It has a lot of heart in that kind of way where it feels very sincere, and it's not just superficial. The kind of movie itself, the characters and everything that happens in the movie is very enjoyable and very lovable at the same time, while having that kind of 80s synthwave and kind of like 80s cartoon kind of throwback feel with everything, with the kind of power glove super weapon that the main character has and all that stuff. It's a ton of fun. All the villains, all the kind of gruesome. This is a very gory movie. The gore is presented in a very kind of slapstick, kind of hijinks kind of way. It's kind of like an exclamation point to a joke or to an action set piece or whatnot. It's a bunch of fun. Like I've mentioned before, like with the reference to early Peter Jackson work, it's here as well, and the director himself has kind of alluded to that was a major influence in coming up with a lot of the gags having to do with the gore and stuff. This is a fantastic over-the-top film, and I warmly recommend it to everybody. Tetsuo the Iron Man is a Japanese film from 1989, and it's a very surreal, kind of experimental avant-garde film that's very similar to a lot of midnight movies like Eraserhead, for example. You know, this black and white, very nightmare feeling kind of movie. And it also has a very strong auteur sensibility about it. It very much feels like the singular vision of a single artist, really, even though it's, of course, a collaboration of a lot of different artists. As a special note to the soundtrack, it's quite something. The main story of the movie is very much a kind of body horror and psychological horror story. It follows a main character whose body is slowly, bit by bit, being taken over by machinery. He's slowly transforming into a kind of machine-human hybrid, and there are like metal wires, pistons, and machinery and leaking tubes kind of starting to protrude out of his body, and he's starting to lose himself to paranoia and madness and all in between. And there's a lot of like rather quite kind of similar structural kind of things as a lot of werewolf movies have. You know, these kind of transformation movies and stories with a lot of like Jekyll and Hyde kind of stuff, to where when your transformations are flaring up, you act out in a very kind of brutal and violent and very base kind of animalistic way, or something else. Maybe there's a lot of interpretations about the story of the movie. I personally have my own interpretation, mostly having to do with interpreting a lot of the transformations and paranoia to being basically like the effects of guilt, because the main character is involved in a horrible crime that he's trying to cover up and dealing with the kind of guilt and shame of that. So for me, it's more about that. It's more about the psychological side of it, but the visual side of it is very visceral and undeniable, and thereby it's very much in the more of the kind of body horror side than the psychological side that I was putting on the movie by interpreting it that way. But a lot of people have interpreted it in a lot of different ways, so, having to do with closeted homosexuality and things like that. There's all sorts of theories and ways people like to interpret movies like this, and that's one of the best things about art. When you consume movies like this, when you view them and watch them and get to explore them and experience them, they become your movies. They become the way you interpret them and you internalize them, and that's the magic of art. And I love it, and I love this movie for inspiring me as well in quite many ways. And I warmly recommend this to just about everybody who can basically take it. Being an avant-garde kind of experimental movie, this movie has a pretty hectic pace to it. It's not a long movie at all, and it's loud and gross, but I still warmly recommend it. It's really good. Undefeatable is a kung fu action movie from 1993. Now, this is an awesome, balls-to-the-wall, kind of so bad it's good kind of action movie where the hand-to-hand combat sequences are really great. The stunts are really great. The kind of knowledge and skill that goes into a lot of these fight scenes and the choreography is just awesome. This is a very entertaining movie, and again, with some beer in your belly and your mates around the TV with you, this is a lot of fun, a ton of laughs, and it's also just a kick-ass movie. It stars Cynthia Rothrock, who is a martial arts machine. She's like a big specialists in tons of different fields in kung fu and all sorts of disciplines and traditions having to do with that world, and she made a big splash in the Hong Kong kung fu movie scene in the 80s, but sadly her kind of paths didn't align with a lot of big projects. She still made great movies, but she was scheduled to work with the likes of Jackie Chan, but things just kind of didn't pan out. But thankfully she She still has some awesome movies, even if they weren't big hits, but we still appreciate them very much. She's awesome, and this movie is about basically this underground street fighter, prize fighter character who's a complete, like, a psychopath maniac who abuses his wife, and when his wife leaves him and kind of escapes the custody of being married to him, he starts to stalk all women who have any features that resemble his wife who he's stalking after. And when one of those people that he winds up mistaking for his wife in his kind of psychotic episode where he's being violent and just killing people left and right on the streets, one of his victims winds up being Cynthia Rothrock's character's sister, and then Cynthia Rothrock seeks justice on her own while the police are also after this maniac killer, Stingray. And after I saw on YouTube the final battle scene of this movie, I was sold immediately. I didn't even care if the rest of the movie was gonna be good, but once I saw it, the whole movie is awesome. Independent fight scenes here and there, just people giving their all. There are some stunts where you wonder, like, I really hope that stunt guy got paid a lot of money for that. You know, there's a lot of cool stuff that happens all throughout the film, and it's kind of tongue-on-cheek as well. A lot of the kind of grimacing faces that people make during fights are like over the top and cheesy and cartoony and all that, and unintentionally. It's the actors' kind of strengths are in the martial arts world, not in the thespian world. So it's fantastic. I just love this movie. Please check it out, and if you're inspired by this, please check out some other Cynthia Rothrock movies. I can recommend things like Yes, Madam and Righting Wrongs. Those are both great that I also happen to own. Censor is a British horror movie from 2021, and it's set during the 1980s, during the moral panic of the video nasties, a kind of era where these censory boards were brought up to cut, edit, and censor movies that had any kind of immoral acts in them, depraved violence, or any kind of sexual content to protect the public from consuming something that might provoke them. You know, people were clutching their pearls quite firmly back then, you know, and this movie follows the story of the main character, who is a member of a sensory board like that, who spends all her days in a room in front of a TV consuming this sort of horrible material in order to make notes and know what to cut from it. The main character is suffering from this kind of horrible childhood memory of her sister getting lost in the forest while playing with her, and she has conflicting memories about that conflict with what people have been telling her happened throughout the years, and she's kind of wondering whether or not everybody's being sincere with her when it comes to what happened, or is she sincere with herself due to maybe denial or things like that, and she's clearly suffering from PTSD due to what happened and, you know, significant trauma. And while she is watching these horrible movies all day, every day, she stumbles upon a scene where she becomes convinced that one of the actors must be her lost sister, all grown up now, and she begins this kind of a quest, this investigation of seeking out who this actress is, what this movie is, and who these people are, to maybe get to the bottom of it. And I'm not gonna tell you any more than that so that I don't spoil anything, but this movie is not only very stylistic and beautiful, and it's the director's first like debut feature film, and it's fantastic. I can't wait to see more from her. And she originally made a short film about the same subject, and this movie is basically that short film stretched into a feature-length film. One of the criticisms of this film is that it feels like that, but I don't feel like that myself. I really enjoy it, and I feel it's not dragging at any point, or that there's fat to be trimmed off or anything like that. the movie deals with the subject of trauma and this kind of like selective memory where trauma can affect the way you remember things and how you interpret things, and when you have people all around you trying to help you with that trauma, you might get even more confused if people don't know what they're doing. And there's great ways that conflicts with the kind of field of work that she is in, to where a lot of those kinds of elements having to do with the trauma and with the kind of memory loss are also kind of expressed in a very horror movie kind of way. There's a lot of like lighting effects and things like that are very Dario Argento looking, very like Suspiria or other, giallo kind of Italian horror movie type of things, where it reminds me a lot of that, and it's beautiful to look at. This is a very lovely movie, very fun, and very it's more interesting and intriguing to me than scary, but that doesn't matter. This is great stuff. I warmly recommend it to any horror fan or anybody interested in these kind of psychological stylized dark movies. Weekend is a British romance film from 2011, and it tells the story of two characters meeting each other for a casual fling, but who wind up spending an entire weekend together and wind up falling in love with each other. And because of falling in love in that short of a time span, both characters are kind of questioning the validity of the love affair and the sort of like apprehension that it brings about going into an actual relationship, and there's a serious kind of like looming dread of them both denying themselves true happiness that's staring them right in the face, And in that kind of way, it reminds me a lot of other romance films that I really love. The first one that pops to my mind is Lost in Translation. I would say that if you like Lost in Translation with Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson, I think you would love this movie as well. It's very similar in a lot of ways, but whereas that movie is about an age difference, here it's about the kind of gay world and their relationship to the straights around them, because there's a lot of places in this movie or a lot of scenes where you just feel like you feel bad for the characters and you feel like you almost want to protect them from the outside world of all these cruel assholes that are surrounding them, though the movie never goes into that sort of sadistic route of trying to squeeze tears or outrage out of you by presenting like horrendous assholes next to these characters or anything. The thing is that these characters just feel so real and believable, and I think that's a really big kind of live and die kind of thing with romance movies, at least for me personally, is whether the characters feel believable, and usually that's done through dialogue. And in this one, you totally get immersed and forget that these are actors portraying characters reading lines from a script. The dialogue seems so natural and it feels so like almost improvised or something like that, and everything feels so real. You get so sucked into the whole drama of the thing, and you just wish for happiness for these characters, and you just wish for the best for these two characters, and it's just precious. I just really love this movie, and because there aren't that many romance films that really click with me, I feel like when one does, such as with this one, I really need to kind of, promote it and let people know that, hey, if you're into this kind of film, this is a really good one, and I warmly recommend it to anybody who's into that sort of thing, even though if you're apprehensive about, like, romance films or gay movies or whatnot, it's a fucking good movie. So it's one of those things where good is good. What can you say? But yeah, definitely check it out if you're into it. Shin Godzilla is a 2016 Japanese Godzilla movie, and it's pretty much my favorite of the bunch, which is saying a lot because I do love me some Godzilla movies. And Godzilla is one of those characters, kind of like Batman or something, where he has been around for so long that he has inspired a lot of different interpretations and iterations of himself throughout the years. He started off as a kind of horror icon, being a kind of a metaphor for Japan's relationship to nuclear destruction back in the day, and he was very haunting and terrifying in that. But he moved from there into more of the camp territory, being the kind of funny friend of little kids and all that, and from there he moved more into the kind of Power Rangers, Monster Mash action genre, and now again he is working as a metaphor, because this movie is very much a social satire, or rather political commentary on Japan's way of handling the kind of Fukushima meltdown and the tsunami that hit the country real hard back then. And there were a lot of things that affected this kind of direct action and fast kind of reacting to the things that were going on in the country at that time during the disaster, because of this overbearing and kind of overbloated bureaucracy, like this busybody stuff that was very like over delegating things to different groups. And in this movie a lot of the main characters are just people in suits meeting in rooms in order to have meetings in other rooms, and to decide where to have the next meeting about possibly doing something about the disaster that's happening right outside their window. And none of the characters are depicted as deplorable or anything. They are all good guys trying to do what's best. It's the system that's getting all the criticism here. And besides that, Godzilla himself is haunting and horrifying in this movie. He looks like he's something out of Chernobyl or something. He looks completely monstrous and terrifying, and the destruction he brings with him is just awe-inspiring in this kind of terrifying way, where it's very reminiscent on purpose of the sort of like news footage of the destruction that the tsunami caused on Japan's soil, and the kind of trail of just this black smoke and destruction he leaves behind him is also just this, it just stuns you when you're looking at it. But this movie, while Godzilla is really cool in it, while he's really awesome, and he is depicted in a fantastic way, since this movie is directed by Hideaki Anno, the man behind Neon Genesis Evangelion, one of my favorite anime series, and he knows exactly how to depict themes like this and creatures like this, and all the editing, the perspectives, the music, all that is like superb. I really like his style. His thumbprint is all over this movie. But what I meant was that while Godzilla is depicted as this very cool monster and this kind of agent of destruction and kind of wanton rampage that you can't do anything to, almost, the movie focuses a lot more on the kind of systematic reaction to this destruction, and it's much more of a kind of dry procedural. If you're a fan of like political procedurals or kind of like, let's say, hard sci-fi, where you're really interested in the nitty-gritty stuff and the kind of how the sausage is made behind the scenes kind of stuff, it's very interesting, and I would very much recommend it. If you're somebody who's looking for that Monster Mash action, I sadly have to say that this isn't really for that purpose, even though Godzilla is super cool in it. But, gushing over how cool Godzilla is in is completely dependent on you enjoying this whole process of critiquing the kind of overbearing bureaucracy of Japan. And since there is reason for the criticism, I'm glad this movie exists, and I enjoy the hell out of it, and I warmly recommend it to you if you were interested by what I said. Invisible Man is a horror movie from 2020, and much like the Godzilla movie I talked about earlier, this movie also uses the kind of idea of a monster movie to talk about a very important subject that needs to be at the forefront of like public discourse and stuff, and it's about this kind of domestic abuse and these controlling relationships where kind of narcissists and sociopaths manipulate and gaslight their victims and leave them with anxiety and post-traumatic stress and all that. And those kinds of horrors deserve a horror movie to be discussed in. And The Invisible Man is not used as, this kind of a gimmick that makes it all corny. No, in this movie, the Invisible Man is very fitting as the main character, survivor of this sort of a domestic abuse, is completely paranoid about this ex-boyfriend stalking her and surveying her and being just around the corner ready to pounce on her and abuse her some more and all this sort of stuff. It's very effective. It's very well done. The story is very good. I don't want to spoil all that much, but much like you might have already guessed, the movie is about a survivor who escapes one of these kinds of relationships, and when the person that's after you is actually an invisible man, it's very easy to come across as like a crazy person to your the people who are around you and trying to help you and understand you. But when you're trying to tell them that your assailant and your abuser is standing in the same room that you are right now, it's easy for the kind of gaslighting to take effect. Everyone will think you're crazy. And speaking of crazy, I think this movie gives me really good, like, Sarah Connor kind of vibes. The sort of mental asylum stuff, the sort of everybody thinks you're crazy, but you're not delusional, you're not trying to, hide from the truth. This horrifying menace is after you and nobody believes you, and it's, desperate and horrifying. And the third act of this movie, without spoiling anything, gives a lot of those vibes and is magnificent. This movie's really great, and I love the way it uses framing. It frames a lot of scenes in a way where it leaves empty space where you would normally fill an actor, into that space, but it leaves it empty so that your own mind starts to wonder whether the Invisible Man is standing there, and sometimes it kind of confirms or hints at confirming that suspicion, and sometimes not, and you never know when he is actually present and when he isn't, and it's fantastic. I really love this movie, and I warmly recommend it. A lot of people might have, been kind of disappointed that it wasn't anything like the original Universal Invisible Man, but to be honest, that's not even really like a horror movie or a monster movie, really. It's kind of a comedy, if you ask me. The Invisible Man prancing and dancing around, just, having the time of his life, going about doing hijinks and kind of tricks and pranks on people, some more lethal than others, with his newfound invisibility he got from a magic potion. So, I laugh when I watch the original Invisible Man, and I'm sure a lot of people laughed when it came out. It's not anything really serious, but this one is dead serious, and I really recommend you check it out. We're down to the last movie of the video, and it's The Greasy Strangler, a crazy, absurd, bonkers off-the-wall kind of a comedy movie from 2016, and I just love it to bits. It's disgusting and gross and horrible and bizarre and weird and unique and quirky and all that, and I love it to bits, and I tear up whenever I watch it out of laughter, out of maniacal laughter, and I keep wanting to watch it day after day. I've seen it now countless times. I can't even keep up with the number, because every time I watch it, I tend to want to watch it again the next day. Don't ask me why. It's just so pleasing to watch, and for all the wrong reasons. Because yeah, this movie is absolutely grotesque and just horrible to look at. The grossest stuff you can imagine. Well, of course, not going over too many limits. I mean, a lot of people have compared it to John Waters movies, and if you know John Waters movies like, let's say, Pink Flamingo, where an actor actually eats dog shit, it's not that territory. And I think a lot of people want to compare it to that as a kind of a compliment, though others compare it to that as a criticism, that it tries to be like a John Waters movie. And I don't buy it. I just think the writers have a very quirky sense of humor, and they just wanted to write something that made them laugh. And I definitely can relate to that sort of attitude when it comes to this movie. It's just hilarious. It tells the story of this father and son duo who work as these kind of tour guides for this completely bogus disco tour. And the son cooks for his father, who wants to eat everything extra greasy. At one point he says he wants enough grease to lubricate the world, and there's a reason for it, because his father prowls the nights and then stalks the streets as the greasy strangler, a serial killer who coats himself in a layer of grease and indiscriminately kills his victims in the night, and then goes to the local car wash to wash the grease off. And there's also a love triangle between the three. The son falls in love with one of their customers on the tour, and the father becomes jealous and tries his wilds to charm this woman. And when I say charm, of course it means like this creepy, disgusting grossness that I can't even describe without just straight up showing you. It's awesome. There's so much full frontal nudity in this movie. There's the food that the characters consume already is so disgusting that it makes you want to barf, but all the sex scenes, there's multiple sex scenes that are just horrendous to watch, but if it weren't for the fact that they are hilarious as well, you might just puke in your mouth a little bit. There's a lot of gross nudity in the movie, and I don't want to spoil the ending of the movie, not that it really matters, but I described it to one of my friends who also watched the movie, and I described it as, how in a lot of role-playing video games, there's the actual ending to the story, and if you do some sort of a great accomplishment, you might get a alternate ending, a kind of a renegade option. And I feel like this movie, once it comes time to go to its climax and kind of end the story, it goes to an alternate kind of renegade option, which is very fitting for this movie. It's fantastic. I love it to bits. It's one of my favorite movies. I didn't want to recreate a top 20 favorite movies list, because the one that I already have on my channel still holds up, even though the chronological order might be different, and I might want to add stuff like this movie in there. But these recommendations work just as well. But believe me when I say, this is perhaps my favorite comedy movie of all time, and you should really check it out if you're not too squeamish.